minus 20, still counting at this time. We have ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have ignition.
Pitcher, all program started. Vehicle going now to an azimuth heading of 72 degrees. All 5 F1 engines started.
Good afternoon and welcome to the ATCO SpaceLab Speaker Series. My name is Claire Porbay and I'm a platform specialist with the transformation team at ATCO, and I will be your moderator for today. Now, I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples that are the traditional custodians of the land that we are on today. I will take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place, and in doing so, recognize the various traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands on which ATCO supports communities and customers, and I offer each of us the opportunity to do the same, wherever you are joining me from today. I am honored to live and work in Treaty 7, the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Niitsitapi, comprised of Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani nations, the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary, Mohkinstsis, is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. I would also like to pay my respect to elders, past and present, in the communities and regions where we operate. Now, this is the second lecture in the ATCO SpaceLab Speaker Series this year. And these lectures are a chance for us to share knowledge and insights from thought leaders, providing our ATCO colleagues and ATCO's network of peers, partners, and friends with information on promising developments, trends, and leadership in exciting and relevant fields. We previously heard from Dr. Barry Sanders and Dr. Megan Lee from the University of Calgary's Quantum City on March 28th. In case you missed that lecture, please visit ATCO's YouTube channel to find a recording. Now, I mentioned that I am part of ATCO's transformation team. If this is the first time you're hearing about the transformation team, I'm so excited to be able to tell you more today. Now, in addition to presenting this speaker series, ATCO's transformation team also leads ATCO SpaceLab. SpaceLab is an enterprise-wide framework of collaborative support for the creative energy of our colleagues. SpaceLab is a source of funding and expertise for any ATCO employee wanting to test and achieve sustainable new value for the company and our customers. And we have supported the achievements of over 130 project teams since the fall of 2019. Before we get underway with today's lecture, I would also like to remind our online audience that this session is a one-way video and audio format. Please ask questions by using the question icon to the right of your screen, and we'll open up question functionality roughly midway through Dr. Hart's lecture. Now, I would like to take this opportunity to introduce Cole Crook, Vice President of Indigenous Relations at ATCO, who has some welcoming remarks and who will introduce our speaker. Thank you. Over to you, Cole.
Thank you, Claire. Today we're joined by Dr. Michael Hart, who will tell us about how the University of Calgary is actively contributing to the changing relationships between Canada and Indigenous peoples. One of the ways the University of Calgary is contributing to this change is through the university's Indigenous strategy, taa'poh'to'p, which is a Blackfoot name of the University of Calgary strategy, signifying a place to rejuvenate and re-energize while on a journey. The name taa'poh'to'p was bestowed and transferred in ceremony to the university by Kainai Elder Andy Blackwater on June the 21st, 2017. In addition to the name, Dr. Reg Crowshoe, Piikani Elder and member of the University of Calgary Senate, transferred cultural symbols to the University of Calgary, reflective of Indigenous pictographs and petroglyphs from sacred archaeological sites in southern Alberta. The central idea underlying the strategy is that of parallel paths, a respect for parallel oral and written systems, ethical spaces, and a shared journey. We're delighted to have Dr. Hart with us today and look forward to this discussion of the concepts and examples of their implementation and the impact on Indigenous and all people within and connected to the university. Dr. Hart is a citizen of the Fisher River Cree Nation. He currently resides on Tsuut'ina Nation and is the Vice Provost and Associate Vice President of Research, Indigenous Engagement for the University of Calgary. His work and research have focused on creating systems change, program development, and evaluation of mental health, social work, and post-secondary education. It's my pleasure to welcome you, Dr. Hart, and we're excited to hear what you have to share with us today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Greetings, everybody, for wherever you're at. I can imagine that we are in more than one time zone, so I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to connect with everyone, those here in the room as well as those in space. So I thank you very much. I want to also acknowledge, as has been identified, some of the acknowledgements that I would also cover, but I also acknowledge, and as appropriate for my background, Kisimanitu, our creator, our creation, Ganiganuteitzik, and our ancestors, all of our ancestors, as well as Awasisak, the children, including the children we haven't even thought of at this point. So that could be your great-grandchildren. Agwabina also, Kinawau, and all of you. So I'm grateful and acknowledge that your presence and being here and connecting with us. I also want to acknowledge the organizers, of course, ATCO, who helped set up this time with us. And I particularly want to acknowledge the nations in Treaty 7. So as was mentioned earlier, I too acknowledge the nations. I do have there's an overview, but I won't read this off. My focus today is going to be speaking about our Indigenous strategy that we've been utilized here at University of Calgary, and try to pull out some of the learnings that we have up to this point that are from the strategy that may be appropriate, useful, supportive to the work here at ATCO and beyond. So first off, Nina gaskitimegan, me, Nina, gaskitimegan. So here's a picture of a black wolf, and so this is who I am. If I was using my introduction, my own Cree language. I've worked in many areas, including post-secondary administration, which is what I'm doing right now. I'm also a research administration, so I'm working in post-secondary research administration. I've worked in social work education for a number of years, and I've been a developer and manager of programs in a variety of settings. My formal training is that I'm a family therapist. I've focused on mental health. I've addressed matters of addictions, particularly around solvents. I've worked in the area of child welfare. In addition, on top of these things, I've done a number of private contracts throughout the years. Through all this, my greatest learning has been from the elders that I spend time with. So here's a picture of my late adopted father with some of my adopted brothers here. So in this role as a Scapios, I've been an elder's helper for longer than I have been in terms of the learning about from my university degrees, and that was shy to say about 22 years of effort to get where I was through the university systems. In moving forward then with the presentation, I think it's important to recognize, to start us off, to recognize the importance of Indigenous peoples' journeys. I think it's important to recognize that Indigenous peoples, at least here in Canada, I would say in other places such as Australia, Indigenous peoples were throughout all the lands. And so there was no area where we didn't have Indigenous peoples present. That speaks about the importance of territorial acknowledgement or land acknowledgements and the people's connections to the land. I recall hearing one Blackfoot knowledge keeper express how the top soil, the top section of the earth is his ancestors. So as I stand here, we're his ancestors, where I acknowledge that I'm impacted by his ancestors of these lands, that they are part of him, they're part of the community, they're part of these lands, and as such have now become part of me as I spend time on these lands. Indigenous peoples have our own histories, and these histories vary, histories with one another, histories that where their own cultures and progressed and changed and evolved over hundreds, thousands of years. And so history doesn't begin in 1492 for Indigenous peoples, and it's important to recognize these histories because it is through understanding these histories before and after 1492 that we come to see that Indigenous peoples have their own cultures, values, beliefs, understandings, and that all of these things, the values, beliefs, understandings, have been translated into particular practices. These practices will vary from nation to nation of Indigenous peoples, and some things are shared, some things do come together. Indigenous people have been creative, have been developing, have been adapting, and have been influencing in many ways, both in terms of in relation to the land, in relation to one another, in relation to the things that they've already developed. And so they continue to grow in many ways in all of these areas. Indigenous people, we have and had our own economies. That these economies included extensive trade and development of trade. It's important to recognize that, for example, I'm aware of findings in the far north of Canada, particularly Manitoba, where there's findings of materials tied to the St. Lawrence River down to the Gulf of Mexico, over into British Columbia. And the only way you would be able to do that is either you individually travel all that, but I suspect it's more from the interconnected trade routes. It's important to recognize Indigenous peoples have had, and we continue to have, political systems. More often, for the longer history, it's been our own political systems. So that means we have our own processes, our own agreements, our own territories identified, our own institutions. And while these institutions and agreements, etc., have been impacted more recently being 500 years, they continue to exist and express themselves in different ways. And as well, we had our own social institutions, both formal and informal, and that include means of education, means of social interaction, means of taking care of our own health, taking care of our communities, etc. I say these things because we tend to look at the connections, particularly between European settlers and Indigenous peoples, as is the start of history for Indigenous peoples. And that's not accurate. It's important to recognize what people have been able to do. When you look at, for example, at your supper plate, regardless of where you're at in the world, 2/3 of the food staples, the basic staples, are Indigenous to the Americas, both North and South. There's many contributions Indigenous peoples have made prior, whether that also has to do with housing development, I'll even say apartments. If you look at the Asinasazani, for example, you look at means of getting through different terrains, whether knowledge of the brain and the anatomy that Indigenous people, there are so many contributions Indigenous people have, and we tend to gloss over those contributions when we start from the connection between Europeans and Indigenous peoples. There is an impact of imposition and separation that has happened since that connection, and I won't spend a lot of time on this because it deserves its attention in of itself. I highlight that this imposition, for example, this image of manifest destiny, which it's called, really reflects those dynamics or the perspective of the relationships and the impositions. And here you see from the image some Indigenous peoples in the darker area being pushed away, chased away by other people, including, and I'm assuming, an angel carrying what I would also assume to be a Bible. And these things come and were used and imposed on Indigenous peoples, creating separations, including separations from the land, separations from one another, separations from their ideas and understandings and practices. There's been significant changes despite or in light of some of these impositions, and of course the most in Canada here, the most recent one that's been acknowledged and is being addressed has to do with residential schools. But even prior to that, there's been some significant changes that we need to pay attention to, and that includes more than just this list here, but it includes things like the repatriation of the Canadian Constitution in 1982, in which existing Aboriginal and treaty rights are hereby recognized and affirmed, for example. And so, as such, Indigenous peoples are intrinsic to who we are as a nation in Canada, and I would say globally, are intrinsic to the territories where other activities are happening or other peoples are standing side by side with Indigenous peoples. The Royal Commission of Aboriginal Peoples, the report in 1996 that was released, it was a major report, extensive and much information there, but it ended up sitting on the shelf. Despite that, we could still go back because you see a consistency with a lot of material shared in that report. What that report demonstrates is that at that time, there was a degree of consciousness that was brought forward about the relationship between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples. More recently is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, a document which took more than a couple decades to develop and was brought forward in 2007 and passed by all but four nations, Canada being one of the four. And so it wasn't until later on that Canada fully accepted the declaration. Prior to that full acceptance is the Truth and Reconciliation report tied to residential schools. And this created a deeper awareness that things did happen to Indigenous peoples, that we're not making up stories. It was impactful compared to all the previous times in terms of creating change, that people were open and aware. But I would suggest even at that time in 2015 and a few years after that, people were along the lines of the earlier reports, and so it swings a little bit of support and it starts to swing away. So a key thing that had happened was in May were in findings in Kamloops, the Kamloops Residential School of up to 215 children's remains on the grounds. And that was something concrete and real that impacted the Canadian population. And so these things taken together, you could see a progression of change. And particularly since 2021, the willingness and the desire is deeper within the Canadian population for change. We are tied to this flow of change at the University of Calgary. And in 2015, there was a committee tasked with the development of an Indigenous strategy, recognizing things such as UNDRIP, things such as the Royal Commission report. And so this committee was initiated, and over approximately 17 months, just over a year and a half, people came together, elders, senior administrators, to oversee its development. There was more than 2,000 points of contact through various community members, both within and beyond the university. There's people from all nations of the region that were involved, plus many others beyond just here in terms of this region. This includes whether it was an Indigenous organization or a non-Indigenous organization. The possibility for input from a wide source was established and followed through. There's a number of key concepts and processes that were developed in order to facilitate that process, as well as that came out of that process. So amongst the things that I will do is I'll address a few of those. It was in November of 2017 that the taa'poh'to'p was launched. And as a result of that launch, my position was created, and we had other team members hired in that first year. We provide annual reports on our activities, so if you go online and just key in Indigenous at the University of Calgary website, you could get access to the reports as well as other materials to explore and hopefully support you in your learning and development. We are right now in a community consultation on our progress to make sure there's input, to have our community members say how do they think we're doing. And that's an ongoing piece, as I'll explain further. To develop the strategy, a parallel process was developed. So within an institutional framework, there's written terms of reference, and so these are quite typical. And so things like terms of reference, things like setting goals, things like confirming committee membership. What's important about that first stage is that there are parallel processes from an Indigenous framework. And so we acknowledge that. So this would include utilizing protocol, for example, pipe ceremonies, and understanding the role of smudging in these dynamics that start off initiatives that provide a context which to be utilized. So one of the things the strategy did when the university administration came forward with to the elders and saying, we have terms of reference to go forward, and as the elders had stopped and said, that's great. We also have our own processes, and we really should be bringing forward both the processes from the written system and the oral system in order to validate what is happening. So that was the start of the development of our strategy and contribute to a key concept, one of the main concepts I see coming forward in our work. The second stage had to do with going out and gathering information. So your typical data gathering activities, literature scans or reviews and scanning of the region, the context, etc., about what others are doing, as well as speaking to different groups, individuals, creating opportunities for online input. What is parallel to that is the emphasis on gathering stories and processes for gathering stories. So in understanding that in oral ways of how we would gather stories. In Australia, it would be yarning, for example, would be somewhat similar. For us here, it has to do with the importance of hearing particular people, hearing their stories, both personal but community, etc., and passing on that knowledge. Turning to winter counts. So robes that record stories, for example, would be another example of gathering stories. But doing in a way that is relevant to the people who are of oral processes. The third stage had to do with data compilation and analysis. So taking a look at what we gathered. We referred to this on the oral side as bringing stories home, bringing the stories together, and coming to understand the shared and overall stories while trying not to lose the specific stories that people are speaking about or have spoken about. And the fourth stage had to do with the strategic writing, the approval and the launch of the strategy. And for us, it had to do with empowering the spirit of those stories so that spirit would carry us forward. The spirit of indigenization has been used to explain that. But that spirit becomes important because if in understanding spirit, we have to continue to nurture, continue to be in relationship with spirit, continue to contribute to spirit. So this process, these parallel processes, allowed Indigenous peoples to participate in a way that's consistent for what they have come to know, and as well as members of written systems to be able to go forward in ways that's consistent for them. As a result, we have developed the taa'poh'to'p based upon both cultural model of taa'poh'to'p, and that's what I'm about to show you right here. I'll flip through some of the symbols that are in place, as well as the written system representation of taa'poh'to'p. Amongst the things is 4 key ways. So ways of knowing, represented by the sun, the ways of doing, represented by the individual holding the pipe, for example, the ways of connecting, the sun and the structure that would hold, for example, a medicine bag, and the ways of being, represented by the people and how we are. Each of these basically have areas that they would cover, and they address all aspects of our institution, right from our leadership, our senior leadership, down to the people whom we're trying to outreach, from the policies that have already been developed to the policies to be developed, to those who are throughout that system, and they include the practices in the system. So there really isn't anything that isn't touched by our Indigenous strategy. And as you'll see, it through my example, it also includes things tied to the land, things tied such as processes. We call breaking ground in our in the written system, in the mainstream system, and I'll talk a little bit about that shortly. Excuse all the notes, so for those who are watching, hopefully I could keep up with your reading. The parallel paths is a key concept that comes out of the strategy. So I outlined the process of parallel paths, but the concept, if it's in of itself, the idea that we're going to walk side by side, is something that has emerged, and many people are tapping into or recognizing the importance of this. So parallel paths recognize that life is a journey. And so if it's a journey, there's many things to pay attention to. Where we've come from, so our value base, for example, our ancestors, all of these kinds of things become important. What sets us up, as well as our visions, our aspirations, and our movements towards that. Knowing that our visions and aspirations continue to grow. I'm hoping all of us here still have goals and aspirations and dreams of moving forward, whether that's retirement or whether that's a new home or whether that's moving to a new exciting place. Parallel paths recognize that that people reflect oral and written systems and oral and written worldviews. And so it's just a large, and I would say safe way to help us see that we have different ways of going forward. And in oral systems, they really emphasize, as the example given earlier, things such as stories as opposed to a written terms of reference. But it's beyond that, because oral systems, for example, would require relationships and connections to one another, whereas written systems, you could possibly do that and not necessarily establish that kind of relationship. So our thoughts and our focus ends up becoming different. Parallel paths reflect a long-standing process in that it's been present for a long time. It's represented in such things as our original treaties, that we tend to emphasize the written document of treaties, and we don't recognize the oral processes in the development of treaties. But both were present. We couldn't have gone forward unless both were present. It's represented in other things, such as the agreements and the two-row wampum from 1600s. It's represented in more recent things, such as two-eyed seeing, a process for going forward and working with communities to develop understandings, or basically research. So there's a long-standing, it's a long-standing process reflected in many places. Parallel paths tend to honor both paths. So imagine two paths walking side by side. Acknowledge them as complementary, that these are frameworks of how we come to know, do, and connect and be. And if they complement one another, that means then we have to spend time to find out, how do we connect? What are the points of connection that we could create, or that we could uncover, is more appropriately, so that when I'm going forward, it makes sense to somebody else. If I started this session with a smudge, would you be able to understand the meaning of that smudge and how it is aligned to a call to order to initiate the processes? So those kinds of understandings become important, that we see the written and oral systems aligned. Parallel paths means, or is about, Indigenous peoples and other members of the community coming together. I purposely say other members of the community because it may be somebody who's been in Canada 500 years. They trace back their family when they first came 500 years ago to a family that came this morning. So parallel paths means that people from all of these times are walking and coming together to discuss how to maintain, strengthen, and advance the values of both, the understandings of both, and the practices of both. And by walking together with this shared understanding, we could be more equitable in how we're going to go forward and pay mutual attention to both matters going forward, where our actions then are based upon things such as respect and kindness, and that we pay attention to the relationship that we have, including differences and being respectful of differences, including inclusion, meaning that we don't bring somebody on at the end. We recognize that we should be inviting people up front in the very beginning of those ideas. Parallel paths acknowledge that we could journey together side by side and maintain our own identities, our own knowledge, and our own practices. Parallel paths means that we choose to walk together. that it is a choice, you're not forced into it. We choose to walk together and honor and exercise both our individual and collective right as peoples, and for Indigenous peoples as cases, there's a strong effort to try and recognize Indigenous rights because they have not been well recognized in the past. So these rights include the right to be self-determining, to the right of others to also do the same. And I would suggest that this journey is facilitated by the importance of cultural protocols. We're going to go on the land and build a new building. We're going to go on the land and create a new entity. And so we know we're going to disrupt the land. For a new building, we may have a groundbreaking ceremony to acknowledge the significance of that. For Indigenous peoples, that doesn't make a lot of sense for many of us. We understand it through the written system now, but if we go and remain within our oral systems, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit in. What we may do is approach the earth, the grounds, and ask permission to disrupt it. Because for us, we have a living connection to this earth. And so one doesn't emphasize that, the other one does emphasize that connection, and the earth is a living entity. So parallel paths means that we're going to spend time in preparation. And part of the preparation is self-reflection. If I'm going to engage and be aware of things such as values and belief systems and knowledge, etc., I need to be able to do my own preparation and self-reflect on that. How do they come into play for when I am one of the members on my particular path, but how do they come and play in relation to others? What do I need to do to take those understandings and an awareness to develop the relationship within my own path, but also in relationship with members of another path? That what does it mean then to be in relationship, and how is that emphasized or de-emphasized by each path? I would suggest parallel paths is about relationship. It's relationship based. Looking at parallel paths, I would suggest we pay attention to implementation. So we look at commitments. What are the commitments that we're going to be making to ourselves, to one another? What are commitments that we're going to do moving forward? But we'll also pay attention to matters of ethical space, and I'll come to that shortly to explain that or to discuss that further. Other aspects of the parallel path is once we have established the implementation of developing that parallel path or going on a journey together, we want to pay attention to how are we going to maintain the relationship. It isn't just yes, we're going to go and then we develop goals or a vision or hear somebody else and then disappear. There is a relationship that's developed. And for many Indigenous peoples, the relationship we develop is ongoing, and it isn't limited necessarily just to that path or that coming together. That the intent is like any relationship. It'll grow, it'll develop, it'll expand. And we want to make sure that the benefits that come out of that relationship continue to benefit those of oral systems, of written systems. I had mentioned ethical space, and this is a key concept in the establishment of a taa'poh'to'p and continues to be an important concept for us. It speaks to about how we come together, whether it's physical space or whether it's how we set up that sense of space when we are together. Ethical space emphasizes things like being inclusive, that everybody gets to participate, and that you participate in a way that we're not emphasizing the hierarchies. One of the biggest challenges I have is I'm in an institution that's hierarchy-based. And so people often refer to me by my title or by the particular achievements. And so I prefer going by my first name because it attends to the matters of hierarchy. And it's not it's not meant to be disrespectful to me or anybody else, but to recognize we are individuals, human beings with our own values and practices first, and that I am more than just my role. I am more than just what I have achieved. I bring more than that. And so as such, ethical space tends to be non-hierarchical. The written path isn't greater than the oral, and the oral path isn't greater than the written. Ethical space emphasizing being respectful. And respect is defined in many ways. And so that requires us to spend time with one another to understand, what does respect mean for one another? How do I demonstrate respect for you? I was just with a good friend where respect means that allow the other person to share their own experiences of life of the day without having to go and dive in and ask them thinking such deeper questions such as, how was your day? What did you do today? For that individual, that wouldn't be respectful. And so we have to spend time. What does it mean for respect with the people we're engaged in as well as those of other parallel systems? Ethical space means that we all have something to contribute. And we may not understand it right away, those contributions, because of the differences in values and beliefs and practices, that people may be sharing things that's deeply appropriate for their own way of going forward. But we have to, so as a result of that, not but, as a result of that, we have to spend the time with what people are sharing. And that we can't force fit other sharing into what we're doing. So recognizing all have something to contribute, both on individual as well as one path in relation to the other. Inclusion of parallel processes. I mentioned a couple examples of the smudge, for example, the breaking of ground as opposed to asking the earth for permission to disrupt it. These are examples of parallel processes that would be incorporated. The importance of food, for example, for many Indigenous peoples, particularly of this region, but also in my own region, that's a really significant thing. And amongst the first things I see when there's constraints is the cutting out of food. And yet it's so fundamental to who we are as living entities. Like, you try and go without food for too long, you'll last a little while, but it's fundamental. And so when you start thinking about the world view, about the role of food in its connection to the earth, the role of food in bringing people together, how people are able to interact in relation to food, we recognize that there's something else there to pay attention. So using that example, realizing if we just cut this out based upon only our one view, then we're not necessarily paying attention to parallel processes. Another key aspect of ethical space is the idea of safe, that people feel safe in participating. That emphasizes both an individual and I'll say the parallel, the community kind of connections. So us in this room right now, being of different communities, that we come together and feel safe as part of our own community and representing our own communities, for example. So myself from the university, yourselves from here at ATCO, that we feel safe to participate and we create that sense of safety to participate. But that means, again, we have to know what safe means for other entities, for other people and other groups. So ethical space is where people of different worldviews and systems come together. I gave you examples of some worldview perspectives, and that we're bringing these different perspectives together and connecting to them. In order to do that, we have to engage in authentic dialogue, meaning I have to be true to my own understanding of the world, and that I can't engage in a way that I'm saying, oh yes, I'm listening, or yes, I'm reflecting my own, and only giving that half-hearted effort. It has to be authentic, where it's tied to my own ideas, my understandings, perspectives, and practices from my own system, and that I'm truly wanting to hear of the other system's practices in order to engage. It has values such as kindness, such as openness, respect. It recognizes differences and emphasizes inclusion, recognizes others, and recognizes self. All of these things are important to ethical space. It's a venue that supports a lot of reflection, a lot of exchange, a lot of collaboration, an openness to learning. So not going in there with all the answers, not going in there with the goal so firm that you can't deviate from that in any way where you're predetermining what the whole gathering or connection is about. It's having the opportunity to share and to contribute in that aura of safety I previously spoke of. It's opened up through meaningful practices that's relevant to particular nations. it includes centering kinds of statements. So for many of the elders in this region, that often includes an opening call, and call to whether it's creation, etc. But it could also be centering statements that pull us all together to, as full human beings, participating in whatever we're about to engage in, and not task-oriented only, and not jumping into that immediately. It's about sharing parallel understandings and practices and identifying these and use them as a guide for us to move forward. So ethical space and parallel processes are closely intertwined. As a result of this, of us being intertwined in these ways, we recognize that we're on a journey together, that it's inclusive, equivalent, and supportive of one another. Here's a quick example. I won't go into details of it. This is from our main campus landscape plan. You could access this online. It's actually this is only one section out of a small booklet that's been developed. We start with an understanding that we're coming forward with shared visions in our landscape plan. One way is looking at the generations. This is an older reiteration, so that top 7 generations is generations. And we recognize that on a settler perspective or a written systems perspective, the emphasis on sustainability and ecosystems become really important. And by bringing these together, we could develop a shared vision while still maintaining our move forward. We have processes and approvals that go through, and these are reflected for the nations here based upon protocols and song. And so the importance of song for us is for the Indigenous nations of this area becomes part of our parallel processes. It isn't just that somebody's up singing an opening or honor song, but there's actual songs that are tied to particular processes, or potentially songs tied to particular processes. We're learning from the lands, and the stories are represented. So the stories that emerge from the land, for example, but also our way of knowing that's tied to the land also emerges. The emphasis on well-being, the emphasis on ceremony, for example, the emphasis on pathways and gathering areas, the emphasis on traveling the land. So these are some examples of the main campus landscape plan that looks at the parallel processes. The impacts of that we have found at the university in walking parallel paths, of utilizing ethical space, of having our strategy in place, is that we have seen an increase in students and staff and faculty who are identifying as Indigenous. As well, as you may be aware, that there's a contentious matter on hand right now in terms of identity and who it gets to identify, how identity emerges. So what we can say is that using the same methods of self-identification that we've used in the past number of years, we have seen increases in all 3 areas. We're still nowhere near where we should be in terms of representing our population figures in the province or even nationally. There has been changes in policies. We've set up means to change policy, and we have ways to include Indigenous voices for policy reviews. There has been a stronger community connection, so we are overseen by a circle of advisors made up of Indigenous elders, both of the region but beyond as well. And so we have these connections with members of the communities, bringing their perspectives and voicing those perspectives, not on behalf of the communities, but are reflective of these community voices and perspectives. We have changes in our foundation activities. And so we have started, even convocation, for example, we're starting to implement some of the changes around convocation and what people wear. We have the honor song included. We have our changes to the program, for example. So there are some foundational activities that are changing. When a new program is developed and being implemented, or an already existed program is about to be implemented, it goes through a review that includes attention to Indigenous engagement. We've created new supports within the university. This would include educational learning opportunities, whether it's online, whether it's through workshop format, or whether it's through self-directed learning. We have supports for people in their learning. These opportunities include, as I mentioned, individual, but also connecting with other members within the university who are engaged. We have an implementation committee made up of approximately 30 plus members and 7 subcommittees orientated to implementing this strategy, as well as that there's additional committees throughout the university looking at the strategy. Now we need to increase that, but it's still touching on several hundred individuals in different ways. We have a number of elders, as I mentioned, on a circle of advisors, but beyond that, probably over, I would suspect we're over 100 different elders that are involved with the university at this time. What we have seen is that we have many organizations approaching us, asking us, oh, how do you do things? And share with us what you're doing. So we do have, we are seen as a model for some other organizations on how to initiate actions tied to reconciliation. So moving forward, we see Indigenous engagement is not a set or a list of tasks to be completed over a set time period. That's very, very much our standard model of practice. But Indigenous engagement, if it's about relationships, if it's about connecting with people, it's an ongoing process then. So it's more than a task. It's more than something to be achieved and then you're done. It's about an ongoing relationship. It's about changing who we are and contributing to our larger societal growth and evolution. It isn't something that people are doing for Indigenous peoples. It's something that we're doing for all of us. And that a lot of the changes that have to happen are not with Indigenous peoples. It's with non-Indigenous populations in terms of coming to a deeper understanding about this relationship, both historically and both in terms of our aspirations. It's recognizing that by it being about each of us, then we have a way to contribute, or we have a commitment to contribute. It impacts us many ways, so that's another key piece that we see moving forward, and we have to recognize that it will impact us. Some of the impacts aren't wanted. Sometimes these are based upon very racist kind of ideas, and sometimes it's because it's a different direction for one of the paths, for example. And what I would really emphasize is that our strategy at taa'poh'to'p, Indigenous engagement more generally, these processes within them is a source of opportunity for all of us, both as individuals but also as organizations, to be better than what we have been. Some things we need to do then is supporting individuals regarding acknowledgement. And so within an organization, I've been doing similar work for a few decades. And what I note is that unless you have an organization has a commitment by senior administration, things don't move very well. And so I would emphasize the importance of senior administration's commitment to Indigenous engagement. And it requires organizational participation. And so what I mean by that is that it's throughout an organization. That will grow over time. More aspects of the organization will get involved. But ultimately, it requires the whole organization to be involved. We want to support individuals and their learning opportunities. So how do we get to this position? What I mean by that is how individuals have to know, why are we even doing this? Why is this an issue? Why is this a matter? Or why is this an aspiration that we want to do? So understanding some of the historical pieces. Understanding the scope of change that is needed. And it be related to the organization, may be related beyond that for an individual. What kind of change is needed? And moving away from deficit thinking. We need to help people learn the difference between a deficit position and one that recognizes individuals, communities, etc., more fully, and that we are moving forward in our dreams. We need to support individuals to be supportive. And so this has a big impact on individuals. Some people, as I mentioned, get very angry. angry about change generally, but some of it get very angry because they're confronted with beliefs that they may have held onto, and they're coming to realize these beliefs were inaccurate, they're based upon false information, or these beliefs go against my own beliefs in terms of my faith, for example. And so there's people who will need support and understanding in how to navigate these challenges. Support means paying attention that we have to know our limitations, know our commitments, and know our strengths. So we have to support people to develop an understanding of these things. We need to support individuals to plan and to create or identify actions to take. So amongst that, more generally, nothing about us without us. It's a common term used for many groups. And what this means is as we go through this, we should be constantly checking in with one another about what it means to move forward. Checking in between those of the written systems and oral systems. That is an ongoing piece. I would suggest that it's a greater responsibility for the non-Indigenous peoples or the written system, because they haven't had that opportunity to come to understand what Indigenous peoples are about and what are our dreams, what are our aspirations, how do we do things. And so because of that, and because that the written system is more likely the position of power, meaning the ability to implement those visions and dreams, that there's a greater obligation of those of that system to understand where Indigenous peoples are. In order for me to get into the position I am, I've had to come to understand both the larger systems in society and the university system. I've had to become versed well enough that I can interact in a written system as well as anybody else in that system. That's not the same for people of the written system and going to Indigenous systems or oral systems. And we don't recognize that there's a parallel commitment that people have to go through in doing that. So plans and actions include nothing about us. We also need to recognize in plans and actions the benefits of Indigenous contributions. Now, I would expand that to meaning not just Indigenous contributions back to Indigenous communities. Of course, that's, I take that as a given. But contributions Indigenous peoples make to society, make to an organization, make to people that are gathering. And I do emphasize, again, if you notice, I use it quite often, our aspirations and our visions as Indigenous peoples, we have them. And not everyone recognizes that when they're stuck in a deficit perspective of Indigenous people. So in terms of creating a supportive, growth-oriented, transforming environment, I would suggest to support your colleagues. For us, it's understanding a taa'poh'to'p, but helping your colleagues understand what does it mean to be indigenously engaged as an organization, as a corporation, creating ethical space. It means modeling some of these things. It means yourself doing it. And so when I emphasize senior administration being involved and making a commitment, that also means modeling some of these dynamics. It means challenging one another. So those long-held misconceptions, to challenge one another in a safe way, because it is about being ethical spaces, may include our own membership coming involved. Focus on transformation, a commitment to renewal, meaning that this is an ongoing, and we're going to renew this relationship and come back and visit. And I would emphasize, maintain hope that things can be different. A few things for consideration that you may ask. What our team looks like, what our teams look like. So organizations are full of teams. What does the team look like? Who's present? Whose voice is present actually within a team, regardless of which system? Who's present? How people get to be present in the different teams. So that brings in a whole bunch of things, both in terms of describing the roles that someone may be wanting to move into, whether from outside or within an institution, but also how we do that outreach for those roles. How do we support people in those roles? So how do people get to be present? How are spaces set up in terms of shared ethical spaces, for example, but also safe places for members of written and oral systems. I would suggest a place such as here probably has a lot of written system spaces. We could look at that. But how many oral system spaces do you have, and how do you facilitate that for anybody to use, for example? What supports are in place? I spoke about that a little bit. How we support knowledge development, so research and its applications. What are we going to do about that? How is that focused? How do we support individual development? What's the recognition that somebody is learning about this? How do we acknowledge and encourage this learning? How do we creating an ally culture? One of the things that we're doing at the University of Calgary is developing an extension of ally culture to a relatives culture, because ally culture is often based upon a metaphor, a war metaphor. Or competition metaphor, whereas relatives concepts is based upon our Indigenous processes. And so we see one as parallel to the other. I say the relationship culture comes, we're developing that after the ally, because we do have some ally training, and what we're wanting to do is extend that. So how are you creating at least your ally culture? And what is included in promotional expectations and processes? These are some other questions an organization could ask itself.
Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael. With that, I'll move us over to our Q&A session, and just a reminder to all of our attendees online to ask a question using the Q&A feature, which it will be to the right of your screen. And it is a moderated format, so once questions are published, you can see them and upvote them, and I'll do my best to select a broad range of questions. Now, we have a few questions that have come in already from our online audience, so I'll start going through a few of these. So our first question comes in. It says, thanks, Dr. Hart. Towards the beginning of your talk, you mentioned your experience as an elder helper. Can you share more about how your experience doing this has influenced you?
Well, I was clearly influenced or guided by my own family in terms of how to interact with members of the family, within my community, of other Indigenous peoples. One of the things that this early experience provided with me is an expanded or a next level that I could build upon. So what I mean by is, what does it mean to approach an elder? What does it mean to interact with an elder? What sort of things should I pay attention in terms of providing support to an elder? What does it mean in terms of carrying forward our values, our practices? When is it appropriate to do so? When is it inappropriate to do so? So while my family gave me a foundation, this time as Oskapios extended that foundational learning. It's those kinds of things that I find particularly relevant to the parallel process in terms of oral system processes, and it's given me the ability to look at those places where we can connect and those places where we don't. So that helps me understand about different ways of connecting and making those connections relevant to Indigenous peoples. So I think that's a quick overview on some of the things about that early learning that I've had. I shouldn't say early learning because it's still ongoing. I still spend significant time with elders and knowledge keepers.
Our next question comes in. It says, Dr. Hart, can you share with us anything surprising you learned, or maybe something that challenged your thinking during your outreach to the community to develop UofC's strategy?
The development of the strategy, so I'll speak about my initial participation in development. It was actually seeing the strategy online that was one of the main reasons why I actually applied for the position that I'm in now. So that in of itself might be a significant moment, is seeing how much time and attention and how well the university brought in the understanding about that there are parallel ways, that there are some similarities and differences, that we could use parallel journeys to come to understand the similarities and differences so that we continue to walk together with one another. It was the strategy itself, seeing it online and reading it, that impacted me, that I said, I want to be part of this. And I made a choice. Other matters have made it possible to make the choice to move from Manitoba to here to take on this role. So I would say just the strategy in of itself is probably one of the influential things. I would suggest also the opportunity to connect with a number of elders that are tied to the strategy, including nations such as the Stoney Nakoda, including the Blackfoot, members of the Blackfoot Confederacy, members of Tsuut'ina, the Métis Nation of Alberta, but even beyond, where we have other elders involved from the Anishinaabe, from Muskogeese, for example. So that opportunity has brought me great, I'll say, joy. So to be in a position where I get to be able to engage with the elders in this way is probably one of those things that really stand out for me right now.
Thank you. Our next question comes in. Thanks, Professor Hart, for this presentation. 7 generations is a long outlook. What practices or approaches might one use to adopt this mindset of looking out for the next 7 generations? Do you think some technology, for example, social media, has impacted our ability to adopt this long-term outlook?
I'll do the first part. You're going to have to repeat the last part after. So in terms of 7 generations, I'm going to use that as an example about differences between nations. As I mentioned in the landscape plan, it's been developed to just say generations. The concept of 7 generations, one of the main places of it comes from the Anishinaabe Nation, and they speak about a journey of the people from the east to the west, and at the 7th generation, there's going to be a key decision about which way to go. So that's one example of the tie to the 7 generations. But there's many other nations that speak about 7 generations in terms of outlook, looking forward 7 generations from now. For my own nation, the Cree Nation, when I think about my great-grandparents, if I was to speak of them, one of them would be referred to as Taa'poh'to'p, so male or female, that would be Taa'poh'to'p. And my great-grandchildren would be referred to as Taa'poh'to'p. So it's our way of not only, of course, a term of affection and endearment, but it's also demonstrating that those 3 generations before me and those 3 generations that are to come are interconnected. And so that's a full circle of those 7 generations. And my role is, because those generations won't meet one another, and my role is to make sure that linkage is there between those generations. So while I'm fortunate enough to know probably at least 5, possibly, I'd have to go back and count, 6 generations back into the early 1800s on the Cree side, I don't know many stories about them until I start getting more so to my great-grandparent and grandparents. So I could take those stories and I'd be able to pass them on to my great-grandchildren. Ideally, I'm getting old and I still don't have grandchildren, so fingers crossed. But my point is that I'm that link between those generations, and I have a responsibility not just to my own kids that would be great-grandchildren, but great-grandchildren that are in my life, to pass that information on. So there's different ways to understand the 7 generations. With that said then, how do you do that? For us, it has to do with connecting with the elders, making sure we're spending time with them and understanding their aspirations and listening to their stories of their elders, of what they said, what were their dreams and aspirations. So I could tell you about some of how that has winded and weaved in terms of education, for example, in terms of what values were in place, what continues to be in place, why some values don't continue, why some other values have been adopted, and being able to pay attention to that flow, and then using those understandings, those stories, those values, those belief systems, and use that for thinking about what's going to happen down the line. What do I have to pay attention to down the line for future generations, not just 4 years, but several decades down the line? How can I use those perspectives of that past to this point now and tell me which trajectory am I on? So that would be the processes that we would use in terms of an example of processes we use in oral systems. I think you asked another part to that question, though.
They add, do you think some technology, for example, social media, has impacted our ability to adopt this long-term outlook?
So I'm going to speak of it very personally. I think it's significantly impacted us, both in a good way and in a way that we have to attend to. Amongst the things that's happened is that there's so many other voices that are impacting the younger generations. And there's good that comes with that, get a wider perspective. But the challenge with that is, are we providing them the ability to sort through all that information? A lot of that information is coming to younger generations in a way that they haven't been provided the foundation as much as we would like in an oral system, for example, so that they can make those choices about how to incorporate information. So it isn't until, I see it is until much later in mid-adult life that people are starting to pay attention to those things about what have I pulled in, what have I not pulled in relation to my own people and our own decision making. So I see there's pros and cons with social media. And I think the big part, as with anybody, is how are we going to sift through all of that information, and how we're going to use it for the benefit of not just myself, but our people. So that's the last point I would say about that, is I find social media is so individually emphasized that it's breaking down to at least, or eroding our sense of, I'll say, relationship and community connection. Some may say there's new communities being developed, but they're definitely not the same as the ones that we hold in terms of our members physically present in our community, for example.
Our next question is, you've noted many of the benefits of consensus-based decision-making, promoting collaboration, being more inclusive, and creating a shared understanding between teams. But it can also take time. How do you manage the time it often takes to come to a decision?
I'm trying to figure that out right now as I'm involved in so many groups making decisions. I think it has to start off early on. And I know that many of our business orientations is tied to time. And so I recognize it. And so that's part of the parallel processes that would have to be acknowledged. So for myself in an oral system, I have to recognize those of a written system do have some time impacts on them. And so am I going to pay attention, and how do I want to pay attention to that? And vice versa, those of written systems pay attention that there's some processes that do take time. And so how can I set myself up to be able to facilitate the time that may be needed? So, for example, ATCO may be involved with a number of Indigenous organizations, and recognizing that it isn't just for that one particular matter on hand, but potentially you've created relationships that you'll be able to use, relationships that you'll be able to maintain and grow beyond just a one task particularly at hand, and the importance of that. What that ends up doing is creating a larger network of relationships that a corporation could have and could turn to further people's aspirations, whether a particular community within already established relationships or whether it's a new community coming forward. So I think recognizing that relationships isn't task-based, but it's an ongoing piece, can potentially provide you some ways to attend to those timepieces. Now that does take investment. I recognize that. But corporations, I would suggest, are investing in a lot of things in different ways in order to prepare for future dreams or future goals of a company. And I would suggest this is probably an area of investment that a company would also want to do.
Our next question starts off just by praising the session that we've had and how it's been. So I want to thank our person who asked that question for that. And then they go on to ask, or their question is, what advice would you give a non-Indigenous person when they are not equally respected by an Indigenous individual?
There's a number of things that I could address, and so I'll do the first ones that come to mind. The first thing that comes to mind is that we all deserve respect. And if I behave in a way that's disrespectful to yourself or to anybody else, it may be a number of reasons, but I still have to be respectful. The challenge comes is when we're being mutually disrespectful and we don't know it. And so, for example, what would be an example? Talking about or teasing in Indigenous communities or some communities, that you know you have a good in when you're being teased and that you've established a deeper relationship because of the teasing. But if you don't know about teasing, then that could feel really disrespectful. And if someone gets offended from teasing, that could be disrespectful, and in terms of the kinds of reactions you would have around teasing. And so sometimes the disrespect is both ways, and we have to pay attention. So that means we have to look at ourselves and how we're acting, and why is it I feel disrespected? What's the basis of that? As well as that, try to understand the other person as being disrespectful. And definitely it would include engagement in those discussions. And those discussions means, is there another way that we could go forward? And if the person is not open to those discussions, and then maybe it's looking at a different set of relationships to be engaged to address whatever task is on hand. So there's a whole bunch of matters to be considered when one's being disrespectful. But the bottom line, I would say, is that we all deserve to be respected, and ideally respected in a way that's consistent to our own value base and our own ways of being in the world.
Thank you. Our next question. Hi, Dr. Hart. You outlined making mistakes as one of the fallouts in team dynamics. How does this help to build high-performing teams and contribute to achieving organizational goals?
I'm trying to imagine any kind of corporation or business or individual not making mistakes. And so if that's true, then we have to be okay and comfortable that we will make mistakes. And what becomes important out of that then is learning from that and being open to that, focused on what is the learning and how do we go forward differently. So it provides us understanding about which way to go, or to go on a particular matter in a different way than what we have been. We won't progress without mistakes. We would end up standing still. And the University of Calgary emphasizes entrepreneurship in terms of entrepreneur thinking, etc., involves being willing to make mistakes and to grow from that and to learn from that. So I would say that we are going to make mistakes. And do we have a strong enough relationship where we're orientated in a similar way, at least, that will be supportive and accepting of one another's mistakes, recognizing we have a commitment to go forward in a better way with one another as well on behalf of wherever we're working.
We have one question from our attendees online. What progress is being made investigating the graves identified at numerous residential schools? There was an overabundance of media coverage at the onset, but it seems to have turned into radio silence. Is this issue being given the attention it deserves?
So you're only getting at my own personal perspective of it, and what I would suggest is that the graves are, or sorry, let me rephrase that. The findings, because the reason I say that they mimic graves, and the reason I say it that way is because to me a grave is a sacred site. A graveyard is to be respected and honored, and so I have a hard time thinking of these as graves for whoever, these young children being placed there. So on a community basis, communities are doing work and they're connected with different entities, and there is some financial support to do some of that work. I can't tell you whether it's adequate or not adequate. That's up for the particular nations to say. And there continues to be some exploration for potential graves, potential burial sites, I'll say. There is some recognition by the nation overall about changes. You have me here, for example. And so I do think there's a shift in, at least to some degree, greater than that I've seen at other times in my career, to recognize we have to do things differently. So it may not be specific just to the findings of remains, children's remains at these burial places, although that should be continuing, and in many places is, exploring new places where potential burials are. That needs to continue, but also recognizing that this is part of a larger story, and that story is moving forward, is continuing. And so what would I like to see? I do still face people who deny that it happens and deny about the remains, or find ways to excuse the remains. or excuse what had happened. And those individuals tend to want to maintain the status quo. But for the most part, I do see more people residing in Canada and beyond aware that this has happened. They're more likely not knowing how to move forward, and I'll share information about that. But I find that more people, or at least have that initial seed of awareness. So those seeds are still there, and I don't think that's disappeared. I think what the question is about is also what effort is being put forward to have those seeds grow so we could create greater transformation. I think we have to be more expansive in our view of that then, such as whether it's this presentation, whether that's the work done at University of Calgary, whether it's the involvement of nations in new economic aspirations and how those are created. So there is a number, having a bigger picture helps us see how things have evolved and changed. When I was a boy and living in Winnipeg, I knew of one Indigenous organization. And so there has been change. It's slow. It is slow.
I believe that is our last question coming in from online. And if we don't have any other questions in the room? No? All perfect. Okay.
So before we close up, if I could say something. So when I was very young, I was fortunate enough to have my late mother, bringing elders to come and stay with us. And she worked in a position where she was interacting a lot with elders. I've heard this elsewhere more recently, but to me it's attributed to this elder, and he was from Alberta, northern Alberta. And what he asked me when I was a boy, I was probably about 7, maybe 8 years old, and he says, "Tell me about what kind of gifts have you gotten? What have you received?" And so as a boy, of course, I tell him about a toy or whatever it was at the time, or any other physical kind of things. And he said to me, "That's wonderful, that's great, I'm so happy for you." And so I felt good. And he says, "I'm going to tell you about a gift that you'll receive that's greater than any other gift that you're going to get like that, any of these ones you've said." And he said, it has to do when people spend time with you. That's the greatest gift that anyone could give you, because what they've done is shared their life with you. They can't return it, they can't exchange it, they can't get a refund, they've given that to you, and they'll never get that part of their life back. And so when I go into presentations and that, I recognize the life that people give me, and that's a precious gift. So I thank you for your gifts that you share.
Wonderful. And thank you to all of our attendees online who've joined us today. And I want to also thank my ATCO colleagues, and including Cole and his team, who've helped us put this event together. And I invite everyone who's watching to watch our social media feeds and information for future speaker sessions that we will be having throughout the year. And in the meantime, I just want to wish everybody a safe and enjoyable day.